In our society, it's easier to talk about your Republican background, and there wasn't necessarily that ease in which you could talk about a British Army background. But I think people should be quite comfortable talking without any value judgment about the history they have in their own family. 1916 for my family has always meant a family connection to it, and that we had a family relation involved in the forecourts. My granduncle Michael would have been involved, Michael Ríordáin. So I suppose growing up we would have a sense of that and his involvement and what it meant. But my great grandfather would have been a tailor in the British Army, so his son would have been involved in the 1916 Rising. So it's kind of interesting in that way. Our family name is O'Riordan, but it was originally Ríordáin, R-E-A-R-D-O-N. My great grandfather put an O in to emphasise his Irishness. We have family members who died in the Somme. On my mother's side, my grandfather was involved in the War of Independence, but my grandmother's uncle would have died in Gallipoli. So simultaneously this year and last year, I found myself at gravesides of family members who died wearing a British Army uniform, and then at remembrance services where I was keenly aware of part of my family's involved in the struggle for independence. No value judgment, young men putting on uniforms for different reasons, and I think it's just an interesting tale as to how the various different loyalties can be intertwined, and that no history is cut and dried. I think sometimes some political movements try to make a very black and white view of something that happened, or a very black and white view as to somebody's motivations, but it's very different in different circumstances. So I'm proud of my British Army background in my family, and I'm proud of the Republican background as well. If you look at my Uncle Michael's family history, it's interesting that later in life he married a Protestant from the north of Ireland. He had to get married at 7 o'clock in the morning because it wasn't a celebration. He had 2 kids, both of them emigrated to England. So I think the history of Ireland, if you take it from the lens of my granduncle Michael, that his interaction with the church, his interaction with the economy in Ireland was very different maybe to the ideals he had as a young man. And then the more you examine his own archival records and his statements of that day, you get a sense of a 17-year-old who maybe didn't know necessarily what the magnitude of what he was getting involved in. So maybe we've had the kind of reflective view in our house, whereas it can be presented as a very glorious sort of family history. It's a little bit more complicated than that, and that maybe some of the ideals that were fought for some people in that rebellion never really were fulfilled in the state that was founded afterwards. In our society, it's easier to talk about your Republican background, and there wasn't necessarily that ease in which you could talk about a British Army background. But in my constituency, and my political work is interesting, there's an estate in my constituency in Clester, I should say, called Abbeyfield. And Abbeyfield was built for ex-servicemen in the 1920s. And everybody in that estate, who were there all their lives, still have a kind of a reverence to and an understanding of service in the First World War. And there's a little Union Hall, British Legion Hall, still there, that they used to pay rent to, and they remember that as children. So I think people should be quite comfortable talking without any value judgment about the history they have in their own family. But war is a horrible thing, and conflict is a horrible thing, and violence is a terrible thing. And I think maybe we should reflect as to how successful or otherwise these conflicts are, and my own personal belief would be that they don't necessarily achieve an awful lot. For those, I suppose, in Ireland today who don't have a connection with World War I or World War II or the rising of the War of Independence, they have as much to add and as much to contribute to this debate, because no matter where you come from in the world, there will have been conflict, I'm quite sure, in your homeland. And it's about building an Ireland and a Europe and a world which is free from that. And unfortunately, that kind of mindset is under more pressure now today than it ever has been in the past. So there are parallels between what happened 100 years ago and what's happening today. The fragmentation of international community, the rise of nationalism, and the inward thinking viewing of political movements across the world. I find it worrying. I find parallels, maybe not as dramatic, but still, I think if all you get from going to a grave is that this person made a great sacrifice and we should be thankful, but then I think you're missing the point. Your responsibility in public life or as a citizen is to ensure that no young person ever has to put on a uniform and put a gun in their hand ever again. But I think collectively we're failing with that in this moment in time. I suppose initially there would have been families, relatives groups, similar to maybe my own family, who felt the needs that they wanted to know what was happening and wanted an involvement in it. That's absolutely understandable. But I was very keen to promote the idea that this belonged to everybody. So if you're in Ireland, 5 months, you had as much, involvement in this and right to this legacy as anybody else. I simultaneously had responsibility for the equality brief as a Minister for Equality. So I was dealing with a lot of issues around the LGBT community, the migrants community, people from all over the world living in Ireland, people with disabilities. I also had addiction issues as well as Minister for Drugs. So I was keenly aware that, knitted into this whole discussion about revolution and the Republic was this view of how our society should be. And what I wanted to do was, I suppose my teaching background would make me realise that sometimes what departments do and the Department of Education does is sends out a pack or sends out a proclamation to every school, and every school puts it up on the wall, and after a while you can see it kind of hanging down because the blue tack hasn't been changed in a while, and then the paint comes off and we all kind of take it down after a while and wonder why it was up there in the first place, and nobody sees it, just becomes part of the wallpaper. So what I wanted to do maybe was to suggest that we should ask every child in the country to write their own proclamation. If they were starting from here today, if they had a blank sheet, what would they write down? What are their aspirations? What country did you want to live in? What would you want Ireland to be like in 100 years' time? We had one that was put together 100 years ago. Maybe you want to have something different. Not to replace the original, just to test the mindset of the generation that we're going to hand our country to. And that idea took off, and it wasn't a competition just to get the juices running, if you like. And every school in the country came together and they produced their proclamation for their generation. So I'm particularly proud of that initiative, because I think often we hand history to children and say, well, you must respect this now, and this is something that you just have to sign up to the ideals, and that's just the end of it, as opposed to saying, well, look, here's the original proclamation, think about it, learn it, read it, take from it what you will, and then write a new one for your generation. And I'm glad that initiative took off, and I'm glad that we got such a great response to it. I think there was a lot of nervousness about 2016 in the 18 months beforehand, a worry about sort of political manoeuvring, people trying to claim it, make it their own, to make connections between what happened in 1916 and what's happening today, an overly nationalistic view of 1916. And I don't think that happened. I think the people took it on themselves. I think what was interesting as well, the community groups around the country wanting to do their own little commemoration, their own little event. But for me, I think that moment of silence on O'Connell Street on that day, when the president laid the wreath and there's just a collective silence, was quite emotional. And I didn't think I didn't envisage that moment would actually take place. I thought it would be a very busy programme. I thought we'd have a lot of noise and activity, and that's kind of what we wanted. But the silent dignity of that moment, when everything just came together, was quite beautiful. And you can't have those moments too often. You shouldn't have those moments too often, I suppose, because it takes away from them. But it was a really silent, beautiful, dignified moment, and I'll always remember that. I think to listen to as wide as many groups as possible, but to have a vision for what you want for the future, when people look back at this commemorative programme, that it's about the future as much as it is about the past. And of course you have to balance things between, I suppose, being respectful to people's personal family history, that somebody in their family may have died, they have to be respectful of that. but it doesn't belong to a family. It doesn't belong to an individual. In the Republic, there's no hierarchy. The reason why people fought for a republic was that no individual family would have any more rights to a legacy than anybody else, or to the country's legacy, or to the future of that country. So that can be hard to hear sometimes for people who have a deep personal and family connection with something. But no relative group owns it, no political party owns it, and no part of the country owns it. It was something that the entire country can learn from. And that hopefully we can collectively have at least a baseline of understanding that, look, conflict happened, and we can focus on the motivations, which what we tried to do was focus on the motivation, the proclamation. So we spent more time on talking about the proclamation than about the events of the week, because when you drill down to these things and somebody has shot somebody else dead, you think about the policeman who went on duty that Monday morning outside Dublin Castle and gets shot in the face. That person has a family, that person has ancestors, I'm quite sure, who maybe have a different view of that singular event. The motivations, what got people up on that Monday morning, and what they were trying to achieve for their country, I suppose, is what's really important. But let's not shy away from the fact that violence is hurts, stings, and casts a long shadow, and there's very little glory in it. But stick with the facts and look to the future.